Hello, students. This is the video lecture that I'm doing for Chapter 13 in the Mindich textbook, which is all about video games as a form of mass media. Now, I expect you all to look at all the chapters in the textbook, at least heavily skim them, let's say. But this one in particular, it's co-written by a very, very smart guy. I really recommend you check it out. Here we go. Now, the first thing that we need to clarify is what is a video game? What is a video game? It's not immediately clear because the term is used to cover a wide range of things. But I found this definition, which to me feels like a really good definition. A game played by electronically manipulating images produced by a computer program on a television screen or other display screen. Okay, so this encompasses a wide variety of things. We have games you would play on a console with a big monitor, maybe headphones, while you're trash talking with someone over the internet, or something you might play on your phone, like a little Candy Crush or Bejeweled or something like that. And here are some different categories that I found, which kind of, I think, a good way to sort of help organize the thinking. The last category here, a sandbox game, is a game that doesn't have immediately defined levels or no points or no end goal, no big boss you have to fight at the end. Something like there was a game called The Sims many years ago, or Minecraft, which I assume many of y'all are familiar with. I'm going to include sandbox type of games in with video games, but others might feel differently. Okay, just so you're aware of all the different distinctions. So there's many, many different types of things. Things that are played very simply that maybe you could play with your thumb on your phone. We sometimes call these casual games to distinguish them from sort of the more immersive, graphically rich games that you might play on a console. And I did want to specify location-based games. Okay, Pokemon Go is probably the biggest example of this. These are games which rely upon location based technology, like GPS technology, to know where actually you are, so that you, as a player in the quote unquote real world, interact with something in the virtual world. And Pokemon Go is the biggest example of this so far, but I think we probably will see more things like this. And according to that definition I gave, something like Wordle would also be considered a video game, which brings up the question, if Wordle is a video game, does the school of JMS then need to have more classes on video games? Perhaps so. Perhaps so. Before I go over a couple of things, I just want to mention this. There's a push in the last few years to say that games can be educational and that video games should be modified or could be modified to be educational tools, which I'm all for. I'm totally for that. But this idea goes back decades. The original version of Oregon Trail, there were many, many versions of this, started in 1971. This was a text-based game where you were traveling across country on the Oregon Trail. Again, it started as a text-based game, but the idea of using video games for educational purposes is a really, really old idea. Video games as an industry really start in the early 70s with Pong. Pong, this sometimes called video tennis. This is a very incredibly basic game. There's just a sort of a paddle on the left and the right that move up and down, and you bounce a ball back and forth. That was the first arcade, video arcade game that got any kind of popularity. In the 1970s, more and more video games came out. They were put into arcades next to pinball machines, and very, very similar to the early film industry. I think I mentioned that in that lecture. There was a concern, kind of a moral concern. Early movie theaters were suspect because they attracted people, including a lot of immigrants and men and women, to mix together in these dark urban spaces. The concern about video games was very similar, that it was attracting the wrong kind of element, taking teenagers away from school, sucking their money, sort of attracting them into these dens of inequity, as it were. By the late 70s, video games sort of overtook pinball. where at first they were sort of next to pinball machines, then video games start to take over. And in the late 70s, early 80s, that's really considered the golden age of video arcades, when these things were very, very popular. Space Invaders 1978 is phenomenally popular. If Pong was the game that sort of established video games as an industry, Space Invaders just took it to the next level. And I do, honest to God, I remember the first time I ever saw Space Invaders. It seems like a very, very basic game today, but it was, you know, a big increase over Pong. You're just a ship that goes back and forth on the bottom of the screen, shooting aliens above you. And of course, Donkey Kong from the early 1980s. This is the introduction of Mario. There have been many, many other games that have, you know, there have been many other games that have used Mario as a character, but he was introduced in this Donkey Kong. Home gaming systems started in the early 1970s. The first one was Magnavox Odyssey, okay? It may have not been the first absolute home gaming system, but this was the first one to gain any kind of traction. What's interesting about this is that essentially it was Pong. Every single game was Pong. Look at these things on the right here. The idea was that you would paste or tape this plastic thing on top of your TV screen, which would make it seem as if Pong was something else. But in fact, all of it is Pong. I'm going to play a little video here that shows an example, and I think from this you can tell what I'm talking about.
12 different and exciting games come with your Odyssey, each following the same basic play procedures. In addition to Odyssey table tennis, other sport games include hockey, football, and skiing. For the youngsters in the family, there's cat and mouse, haunted house, and Simon Says.
Magnavox Odyssey was not successful. One reason was the name Magnavox. Magnavox was also a company that manufactured televisions. In reality, that game would work with any type of television, but it put in the consumer's mind the idea that it only worked with Magnavox. So I think if you want to take something away, this is a bad use of branding, okay? People thought Magnavox Odyssey only worked with Magnavox TV. Atari, technically I think it's the Atari 2600, comes out in the late 70s. This is the one that just explodes and takes over the market, and this is the gaming system that I remember from my youth. I remember going over to a friend's house before my family got an Atari, and I remember playing Space Invaders. God, we would play it for hours and hours, and in my sleep now I can still remember the sounds of the Atari version of Space Invaders. Okay, if every Magnavox Odyssey game was Pong, every Atari game was Combat, okay? Combat was the default game that came with the Atari 2600. Here's a screenshot of it. Those are two tanks. Yes, those are in fact tanks. Tanks that would roam around and shoot each other. Every Atari game was a modification of this. They didn't look like Combat, but developers had to find ways to use the original structure of Combat to create something else. Adventure was a game based in a Lord of the Rings kind of a fantasy universe with elves and dwarves and castles and dragons, etc., all that stuff. Today we have World of Warcraft. Back in my day, it was Lord of the Rings. Adventure was an attempt to create a video game based on that. And the main character is a cursor. That over there, that little block, that was your cursor, okay? That's a key, that's a sword. What this game is known for is it was the first game to feature an Easter egg. If you went into a room and did something, I don't know what you did, but the name of the developer would show up. The reason this was done was Atari was not publishing the names or giving credit to any of the game designers at all. Atari was just basically putting out a game as an Atari game. So this game developer sneaks his name into the game. The Joy board was, okay, Atari 2600 functioned essentially off a joystick. You had one stick, one button. One stick, one button. That was the controls. The Joy board converted it so you stood on something, and by moving your weight back and forth, you controlled the cursor. I think this is really kind of interesting. I've never ever seen one of these in my life. And you know, I look for old weird stuff all the time, but apparently for people who collect old Atari 2600 memorabilia and devices, this is the most collectible thing. If you can find one of these, be on the lookout. Okay, I mentioned that game developers did not get credit. Activision was a company that was formed by people who used to work at Atari. Okay, they worked at Atari. They knew they were the best of the best. Okay, they knew how to maximize that console and maximize that programming capability. They knew how to take combat essentially and make it look like something else. Pitfall was the first game they came out with. But basically, these were developers who were sick of working at Atari. They split away from Atari, formed Activision. In the early film industry, here's another parallel of film, United Artists was formed for very, very similar reasons, that stars and filmmakers wanted to get credit themselves. They didn't want their name to be lost. So United Artists was started to give more credit and more compensation to individual artists. Activision was the same thing. Atari had a really, really disastrous year in 1982, okay? And it's attributed to two specific games. Pac-Man, this was the Atari home version of the arcade game Pac-Man, which I've already mentioned was very, very popular. The home version was just not a good translation of the experience, but E.T. was the one that was really, really considered to be a disaster. I mean, this is notorious as possibly the worst video game of all time. Now, it's not the fault of the game developer who made E.T. He was given an impossibly short timeline. They rushed it to the market because they wanted to get it into stores for the Christmas season. And the poor guy was like, you know, given the job in August, saying you got to have a game ready to sell in November. The film wasn't even available yet. The film wasn't even done yet. So he's basing a game off of just limited information, and I've never played it, but apparently it's a really terrible game, and it was so poorly received. They literally buried all these consoles of ET out in the desert because they just wanted to get rid of it. There's a documentary you can look up if you want to find it about people who went out and found those old buried video games. Okay, one of the reasons that Atari was unsuccessful was the games sucked. Pardon my language, the games sucked. They flooded the market with too many games of low quality. Nintendo took an opposite approach, okay? If you hate video games, here's a takeaway though. Nintendo had a very, very limited number of games that you could play, but the games were of high quality, okay? So that's the takeaway here. Do you want to give the consumer a huge variety of product? Much of that product may be of poor quality, or do you want to give the consumer a very, very limited number of options, but they are all quality? I would be in favor of limited options, but make them all good. And Nintendo was very, very successful. In the early 90s, there was another moral panic, okay? This has to do with the game Mortal Kombat, okay? Now, video games, up until what I've been talking about, were very, very limited graphics, right? I mean, you've seen Pong, you've seen Space Invaders, you've seen Combat, that's very limited. Now, because of computer processors, you can get more realistic with your depiction, and people fighting actually look like people fighting, and Mortal Kombat took it to the next level and outraged people. I'm going to play a news clip from the early 90s about, I'm just going to play a good chunk of it right here, about the moral panic that was associated with Mortal Kombat.
A fantasy martial arts game that some parents think is just too violent for their kids. Carol Lynn joins us live now from Northridge with more on that story. Carol?
Here it is, Bob, behind me. It's called Mortal Kombat, and we're going to talk to Aaron Brandis here about the game. Aaron, how does it work?
Well, basically, you pick a couple characters, you do maneuvers on the joysticks and buttons, you do moves, and
And then what are
whoever
you trying
wins.
to get to? Fatalities?
Nah, there's a master guy you got to beat at the end. Fatalities are just what happens if you're really brutal to your opponent. You get an opponent, you can rip off his head or something like that.
Sounds like a pretty thrilling game, and this is the kind of violence that critics are pretty worried about. Cold-blooded murder is making Mortal Kombat the most popular video game in history. Kids relish their victory and their bloody choice. Should they pull out their opponent's heart, or simply rip his head off just to see his spinal cord dangle in a pool of blood? How do you feel about cutting his head off? After a $10 million advertising campaign, Mortal Kombat, debuting in home video today, is expected to sell 2 million copies at $50 a pop.
Because of Mortal Kombat, video games started to put ratings on themselves. Now, the important point here is the government did not force this, okay? I repeat, the government did not force this. The video game industry did this to itself to keep the government out, okay? The video game industry said, we're going to put ratings on our games so that the government does not. Exactly the same thing happened with film. Those ratings you see on films are not because the government forces them to do that, but because the film industry does not want the government to do that. Gamergate, I think 2014, I think the year is 2014 when that started. Gamergate is, it's kind of hard to describe, I guess. The people who started it claimed that they were concerned about ethics in video game journalism. Okay, I repeat, the people who started Gamergate were concerned or said they were concerned about ethics in video game journalism. There was a female game developer who it was alleged had an improper relationship with a person who was a journalist, and she was using sexual favors to get positive reviews of her video games. I don't know if that's true or not. I suspect that's not true. But then it just turned into an attack on women in video games, okay? It just turned into an attack on women in video games. There's a woman, Anita Sarkeesian, I believe that's how her name was pronounced. She has a channel on YouTube, and she's had this for many years, and some of her commentary is pointing out sexism in video games, okay? The way women are depicted in video games is often highly sexualized, incredibly stereotypical, and not in a realistic or positive manner. So she's pointing this out. The response is, we're going to kill you, we're going to rape you, we're going to destroy you. I mean, the poor woman had to cancel public appearances because of these threats, which I think is just totally bizarre and doesn't make any sense at all. If a woman is saying that women are not depicted realistically or fairly in video games, the response of, well, I'm going to rape you, doesn't really help the argument, okay? If you have a counter argument, you're not really making the counter argument effectively. I'm gonna play a little clip here. This is from one of Anita Sarkeesian's videos, and it's a topic that I never really thought about before, but when she reveals it and focuses on it, yeah, I think she has a very, very valid point.
For the purposes of this video, I tried to get a glimpse of Batman's rear end, but it's as if his cape is a high-tech piece of Wayne Industries equipment designed to cover up his butt at all costs. I like to jokingly refer to this aspect of a male character's costume as the strategic butt covering. Of course, not all games with male protagonists keep the character's butt obscured or out of frame like these games do. The real issue is one of emphasis and definition. A significant portion of third-person games with female protagonists call attention to those characters' butts in a way that's meant to be sexually appealing to the presumed straight male player. In this regard, the way that women's bodies are depicted is significantly different from the way that men's bodies are depicted.
And in conclusion, I just want to end with this graphic right here about esports revenue. The textbook does talk, and again, take a look at the textbook, co-written by a pretty smart guy. The textbook talks about video games evolving into a type of spectator sport. I found this graphic online, which I'm not 100% certain, is correct. I don't think we all know the future, but it gives you some indication that according to this, esports, competitive video gaming sort of organized in a tournament, a little over $1 billion in 2017, and this thing is predicting almost $6 billion by 2028. So this is definitely a growth market, and a lot of this growth seems to be coming from esports betting, if this speculation is to be believed. So it's definitely a growth industry. If you are not sure about what you want to do for work after graduation, this is an industry you could work in. They have writers, they have coders, they have graphic artists, they have actors. Then there's people to market the products. There's all types of jobs available within this industry. And finally, in conclusion, I'll say there's no doubt at all that when I started getting interested in video games as a form of mass media, there's no doubt at all that it's definitely a form of mass media. When you look at the amount of money made by movies that are based on video games, or TV shows that are based on video games, or just how much money video games themselves make. I'm not even going to give any examples right here, because I want to use this lecture for a while, and there's going to be newer and newer examples all the time. So that's what I'll say in conclusion of this, that video games are definitely a form of mass media and absolutely deserve a place in this textbook and in this class.